Today let's attach some breadboard ends to a tabletop or three with some floating tenons. Hey everyone, how's it going? So a couple of years ago my in-laws renovated their kitchen and they asked me to build them a table using some reclaimed barnwood. In the previous videos in this series that you can check out up here, I went over assembling the tabletops. However, I skipped over the actual attaching of the breadboard, something I will rectify today. Just like the last time, at this point in time, the materials are already stabilized, planed, squared, and cut to final length, except for the floating tenons. I decided to use some leftover pallet slats from my patio furniture build since they were already the correct width required. If you missed the patio furniture build, you can check that video out up here as well. Heading over to the thickness planer, I ran the pallet scraps through down to a 1/2 inch thickness. With that completed, I pulled the router back out with the tenon jig I built off camera and measured the remaining length of the 4-inch long 1/2 inch upcut spiral bit. Okay, so it's 1 7/8, so that's 3 3/4? Yeah, 3 3/4, and that'll give me a little bit of wiggle room. Setting said measurement on the miter gauge for the table saw, I cut many tenons. Though I didn't realize it wasn't enough at the time, so I'll need to do everything over again for a few more, but for the sake of the video, it was done perfectly and with the required total the first time around. Using the completed table base as a workbench holding the tabletops, I mark out the tenon locations on both of the breadboard and tabletops simultaneously with the tenon jig. Now when I go to route out the mortises for the tenons, I just need to line the tenon jig up with the same marks and I'll be good to go. With the router prepped with the 4-inch long 1/2 inch upcut spiral bit, 1/2 inch bushing, tenon jig, and clamps to hold the tenon jig in place, I can start routing out all of the mortises, starting in the breadboards. I'd gone with the upcut bit because they are designed to pull the wood debris up and out of the cut. However, combined with the tenon jig and bushing on the router closing in the top of the mortise, it basically just jammed them all with the chips inside the cut, which required me to stop the cut every few seconds and manually pull all of the chips out with the help of the dust collector and a dental pick. Unfortunately, this did burn me a couple times. Well, not burn me per se, but a couple of the times the shavings did pack up and heat up to the point of starting embers, which luckily I caught before they were pulled into the dust collector. That could have been bad. With the tabletops and breadboards all mortised out, I turned my attention back to the tenons. Putting the router back into the router table with a roundover bit, I rounded over the 4 side corners of the tenons so that they would more easily fit into the mortises. Speaking of the mortises, let's start gluing tenons in them. I throw one of my magnetic parts trays in a sander's bag since it was the closest bowl thing I could think of in the shop and filled it full of wood glue. Then I can smear some glue in the middle of the top and bottom of the tenon and some CA glue on the sides for the immediate hold. Blast some activator into the mortise, insert the tenon, and hold it in place for a couple seconds. The wood glue will provide the long-term hold while the CA glue will provide the clamping force. Since the tenons were slightly thinner than the mortises, I wanted to make sure that all of the tenons were consistent in height, depth, anglage, etc. However, I didn't want to clamp them in place since all of the wood is softwood, and I was concerned that the clamps would end up marring the surface of the table too much. The next day I could come back and clean up some of the glue squeeze out so that the breadboards could actually sit all of the way... Oh man! There we go. Yeah, still bottoms out 1/8 of an inch away. So that means I have to go through and cut every tenon 1/4 of an inch shorter. That's 26 glued in tenons. That's annoying. I ended up grabbing a scrap to use as a cutting guide and cut 3/16 of an inch off of each of the 26 tenons. That was a nice waste of time. Now that the breadboard is actually seating properly, I can start locking them in. My first attempt didn't go all that well, for 3 reasons. A. Working on the tenons first, because you know the best spot to do all of your detailed marking and measurements is somewhere you're immediately going to cover up and not being able to see. 2. Working on the tenons first, again, because it makes sense to do all of your drilling with the final size bit and not expecting it to drift at all. And D, knocking in the dowels without thinning the entering end enough, causing a bit of damage on the way out, which was relatively easy to fix by forcing the splinter back in place and CA gluing it back down. My 2nd through 6th attempts went much better. I marked out the drill locations on the breadboard itself and drilled through the breadboard and tenons all at once with a 1/16 inch bit. Now I can pull the breadboard back off and I know exactly where everything lines up on the tenon, so I can proceed to drill out my 3/8 inch hole immediately north of the original pinhole by 1/8 of an inch to offset the dowel, making sure to elongate the outer holes to allow the panel to move back and forth with seasonal movement. With the tenons drilled out, I can move back onto the breadboard and drill out the original holes on the original pinholes, but not elongating any of the holes in there. Last step before locking the breadboard down to the tabletop is to slather a bunch of wood glue onto the center tenon only, to split the difference of expansion and contraction between the two halves of table. Then I can seat the breadboard into place and begin knocking the dowels into the table, after knocking off one end with the pencil sharpener just to avoid the blowout I had in the first attempt. Then on the last 1/4 inch or so of the dowel, I throw on a little bit of wood glue and tap it in just to lock the dowel into the top of the breadboard, but not the tenon. The next day, once everything was dried out, I can cut the dowels flush and cut the tabletop and breadboard flush with the circular saw, since it is a little bit too big for the table saw. And with that, the breadboards are done. For the first time doing breadboards, I'm quite happy with how these turned out. It might have been a little bit easier if the material I was working with wasn't riddled with rot and bug tracks, but it is what it is. It might have also been easier if I was able to do integral tenons as opposed to floating tenons. It might have saved on router time, but I'm not actually sure. If you don't know what I mean, or if I'm using the wrong terminology, what I did here was floating tenons, where the connecting material between the panel and the breadboard is not part of either piece. The integral tenon would be if I cut or routed off 1/3 of the top and bottom of the panel and fit it inside of the breadboard. I would have liked to have done that instead, however I didn't have enough material prepared. As is, I used pretty much every board I had, and if I had cut the extra 4 inches I would have needed for integral tenons on both sides, the rough boards I was able to get 2 out of, I would have only been able to get 1 board out of, and I would have been about 6 boards short for the whole project, which would have added another 2 to 3 weeks of epoxy and milling time to this project, which I didn't have. In the next video, we'll be finally getting the table fully assembled, finished, and delivered, which will be coming out in the coming weeks. And if you wanted to see how I got to this point, you can check out this playlist up here. And with that, thank you all for watching, and if you like what I'm doing here, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to reading them in the comment section below. And if you want to see more up-to-date projects, you can always follow me on Instagram at John the Schreiner. Otherwise, I will see you here in the next video, and have a good one.